Good evening. I'm very happy that these lectures belong to a series that go on under the name of Arthur Miller, because obviously I knew Arthur Miller as a writer and admired him, but in the last years of his life I had the chance to meet him three times, once for a common panel discussion, the last one for a lunch at our common French publisher in Paris. And so I knew Miller not only as a great writer, but also as a very nice human being, and I missed him. So I wanted to tell what I'll tell in his memory. The title of my speech was announced in the printed program, as far as I remember, of the advantages of literature for life and death. Then it was corrected in the internet program as the advantages of literature of fiction for life and death, to narrow a little the scope. As a matter of fact, many of my remarks will also concern literature in general, including drama, poetry, and other kinds of creative writing. But today I shall deal with a specific kind of literature, which is fiction. Which are the advantages of fiction for life and death? It would be pretty trivial to answer such a question by saying that fiction teaches us a lot of things by making us to understand the human psychology, by discussing moral values through the representation of bad and evil character, and so on and so forth. My problem is rather, how can a discourse that doesn't concern the real world in which we live, but rather possible worlds, persons who do not exist, and events that never happened, how can such a discourse have some influence on our notion of life and death and on our way to accepting them such as they really are? Moreover, how can a series of propositions, which by definition are untrue, can help us to entertain a severe and correct definition of truth? In 1860, on the verge of sailing through the Mediterranean to follow Garibaldi's expedition to Sicily, Alexandre Dumas stopped in Marseille and wanted to visit the Château d'If, where his character Edmond Dantès, before becoming the Count of Monte Cristo, spent 14 years of his life as a prisoner. He was visited and rescued in his cell by the abbot Faria. During his visits, Dumas discovered that the visitors were shown the alleged real place. It happened also to me some years later. And the guys were speaking of Monte Cristo, Faria, and other characters of the novel as if they had really existed. On the contrary, the same guys ignored that at the same Château d'If was imprisoned an historical figure like Mirabeau. And Dumas comments in his memoir, "It is the privilege of novelists to create characters who kill those of the historians. The reason is that historians only evoke mere ghosts, while novelists create persons in flesh and bones." I know Stephen Dedalus better than my father. As for my father was concerned, who knows how many episodes of his life I ignored, how many secret thoughts he had never disclosed, how many times he has concealed his sorrows, his quandaries, his weaknesses, so that after his death I shall never recover these secret and perhaps fundamental aspects of his personality. Like the historian defined by Dumas, I muse and muse in vain about that dear ghost, lost forever. On the contrary, I know of Stephen Dedalus everything I need to know, even though I do not know what he had for dinner the day after the Bloomsday. And at any time I read again his story, I discover something more about him. One of the main functions of fiction is to educate our sense of what is the case. Such an assertion can look preposterous since, by definition, narrative texts clearly speak of non-existing figures and events, and just for this reason call for the suspension of our disbelief. Every piece of fiction can choose as its own background the world that we consider as the real one, and the stories of Nero Wolfe certainly take place in New York, such as it is or was, so that we would feel disturbed if suddenly Archie Goodwin decided to visit the Tour Eiffel in Central Park. But we take as true also the fact that Wolfe lives in a brownstone on West 35th Street, even if we know not only that these buildings do not exist, but also that Rex Stout, in different stories, had located it at different street numbers, so making its existence more and more improbable. In which sense, then, novels educate our perception of what is the case? If in reading them we have subscribed a silent agreement with their authors, who pretend that something is true and ask us to pretend to take them seriously. Let's compare the proposition we can make about a fictional text with those we can make about the world we live in. As far as the real world is concerned, we assume that the laws of universal gravitation are those established by Newton, or that it is historically true that Napoleon died in St. Helena on May 5, 1821. And yet, if we keep an open mind, we will always be prepared to revise our convictions. The day that science pronounces a different formulation of the great laws of the cosmos, or an historian discovers unpublished documents proving that Napoleon had died on, let's say, May 25, on a Bonapartist ship as he attempted to escape. On the other hand, as far as the world of books is concerned, propositions like Sherlock Holmes was a bachelor, Little Red Riding Hood is eaten by the wolf and then fed by the hunter, Anna Karenina commits suicide, will remain true for eternity, and no one will ever be able to refute them. There are people who deny that Jesus was the Son of God, others who doubt his historical existence, others who claim he is the way, the truth, and the life, and others who believe that the Messiah is still to come, and we treat each of these opinions with respect, even those we don't consider false. But no one will treat with respect anyone who claims that Hamlet married Ophelia or that Superman was not Clark Kent. Literary texts not only tell us explicitly what we will never cast doubt on, but unlike the real world, they flag up for us with supreme authority what has to be taken as important in them and what we cannot take as a starting point for free-willing's interpretations. At the end of chapter 35 of Le Rouge et le Noir, the Scarlet and the Black, by Stendhal, it said that Julien Sorel goes to the church and shoots at Madame de Rênal. After observing that Julien's arm was trembling, Stendhal tells us that the protagonist fires a first shot and misses the target. And then he fires again, and then the woman falls. The reader can think that his trembling arm and the fact that his first shot missed prove that Julien didn't go to the church with firm homicidal intentions, but rather was drawn there by a disordered, passionate impulse. Against this interpretation can be placed another one, namely that Julien had right from the start intended to kill, but that he was a coward. And the text allows both interpretations. But some people have, as it happens, wondered when the first bullet went. An intriguing question for Stendhal's aficionados. Just as devotees of Joyce go to Dublin to seek out the chemist's shop where his claimed Bloom bought a lemon-shaped soap, And in order to satisfy these literary pilgrims, that chemist, which, by the way, still exists there, began in 1966, during the first Bloomsday, to produce again this kind of soap, just for the joyous fan. In the same way, one could imagine Stendhal fans trying to find in this real world that church, and even that city, Verrières, which doesn't exist, scrutinizing every pillar to find a hole produced by the bullet. But what would say of a critic who wanted to base his or her entire interpretation of the novel on the fate of that missing bullet? We know of people who have based their reading of Poe's The Purloin, the letter, on the position of the letter with regard to the mantelpiece. But while Poe makes the position of the letter explicitly relevant, Stendhal doesn't say where that first bullet ended up, and do not speak of it any longer for the rest of the novel. As far as the novel is concerned, that bullet is lost forever. On the other hand, what remains unsaid in Stendhal's Armands regarding the protagonist's potential impotence pushes the reader toward frenetic hypotheses in order to complete what the story doesn't tell us, but makes us curious to know. At the beginning of The Three Musketeers, it is said that D'Artagnan arrived at Meung on an old nag on the first Monday of April 1625. If you have a good program on your computer, you can immediately establish that that Monday was April 7. A juicy tidbit for trivia games, but an irrelevant information for the further course of the novel, which are, however, the explicit pieces of information provided by the text. Apart the mention of the year 1625, undoubtedly important in order to situate the story in its historical background, it is thought that it was April. The information concerning the month seems important in order to show later how Porthos was vainglorious. Please remember that in order to hide the fact that this splendid shoulder strap was embroidered only on the front, Porthos was wearing a long cloak of crimson velvet, which the season didn't justify, so much that he had to pretend that he had a cold. The story couldn't have taken place in January, so April is important. Thus, in a possible fictional world, there are some propositions which cannot be called into question, and that therefore offer us a model, however fictitious, of irrefutable truth. On the contrary, a narrative text refuses certain interpretations just because it doesn't display any proposition able to legitimate them. We can say that Porthos was vainglorious because the text says that he wore a long cloak in April. But we cannot say that D'Artagnan was homosexual because it's not possible to find in the novel any statement, suggestion, innuendo, insinuation that allows us to go along with such an interpretative drift. The world of literature is a universe where it is possible to carry out tests to establish whether a reader has a sense of reality or is the victim of his or her own hallucinations. Usually, we can make two true statements about fictional characters because what happens to them is recorded in a text. And the text is like a musical score. It is true that Anna Karenina commits suicide in the same way that it is true that Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is in C minor and not in F major like the Sixth, and begins with G, 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 A flat. But certain literary characters, as well the figures of mythology, happen to leave the text which gave them birth and migrate to a zone in the universe which we find very difficult to delimit. Ulysses, Jason, King Arthur, Parsifal, Alice, Pinocchio, David Copperfield, Little Red Riding Hood, Madame Bovary, become individuals living outside their original scores. And even those who have not ever read the archetypal score can claim to make true statements about them. Anyone who claims that Madame Bovary in the end is reconciled with Charles and lives happily with him ever after would meet with the disapproval of people of sound common sense, as well as one said that Little Red Riding Hood devours the hunter. Where exactly dwell these fluctuating individuals? Certain of them have become somehow true for the collective imagination because the community has, over the course of the centuries, made emotional investments in them. But there is a difference between two kinds of emotional investment. We can really be moved by thinking about the death of someone we love, or experience a physical reaction when imagining ourselves having an erotic relationship with that person. And equally, by a process of identification or projection, we can be moved by Emma Bovary's fate, or, as happened to several generations, be drawn towards suicide by the misfortunes of the young Werther. However, if someone were to ask us if the beloved one whose death we have imagined was really dead, we would reply, no, that it was a totally private fantasy of our own. Instead, when someone asks us whether Werther really did kill himself, we reply, yes. And the fantasy we are talking about here is not private. It is a culturally real fact on which the entire community of readers agrees. We have to find a space in the universe where these characters live and shape our behavior to such an extent that we choose them as role models for our life or for the life of others, and we are clear what we mean when we say that someone has an Oedipus complex, a gargantuan appetite, behaves quixotically, is as jealous as Othello, doubts like Hamlet, is an incurable Don Juan, it's a Scrooge. And in literature, this happens not only with characters, but also with situations and objects. The women who come and go talking of Michelangelo on the fear shown in a handful of dust become obsessive metaphors ready to tell us over and over again who we are, what we want, what we were going, what we are not, and what we don't want to be. These literary entities are among us. They were not there from the beginning of eternity, as perhaps it happened to square roots onto the Pythagoras theorem. But now that have been created by literature and nourished by our emotional investment in them, they do exist, and we have to come to terms with them. Let's even say, to avoid ontological and metaphysical discussion, that they exist like a cultural habit, a social disposition. But even the universal taboo of incest is a cultural habit, a disposition, and yet it had the power to shape the destiny of human societies. However, let's shift to another subject, because today, even literary characters risk becoming evanescent, mobile, and to lose their capacity of being truly and forever what they were defined by a fictional text. We have now entered the era in which, by hypertextual maneuvers, we can not only to travel through, let's say, the labyrinth of the complete works of Shakespeare, but also to change them. On internet, one finds programs which not only let a group of players to start from a narrative stimulus and try multiple stories, whose denouement one can change ad infinitum, but also encourage them to do the same with the classics of fiction. Just think, we were avidly reading War and Peace, wondering whether Natasha would finally give in to Anatoly blandishment, whether that wonderful Prince Andrei would really die, whether Pierre would have the courage to shoot Napoleon. And now you can recreate your own Tolstoy, conferring a long, happy life on Andrei, making Pierre the liberator of Europe. And you can also mix different stories together, making Hester Prynne to marry Ismael, sending Little Red Riding Hood in the woods to meet Pinocchio, getting Cinderella kidnapped by Captain Hook and sold as a slave to Scarlett O'Hara, making Becky Sharp to meet Rip Van Winkle, who at the foot of its tree is discovering the Aleph, the point from which Borges could see the whole universe. Would this be bad? No, because this has already been done by literature with Mallarmé's project of Le Livre, the infinite book, the surrealist Cadavre Esquis, or Queneau's 100 million poems, which you can compose infinitely. And the jam session has been there too. Yet the fact that the jam session exists, where every evening a variation on a particular musical theme is played, do not prevent or discourage us from going to a concert hall where every evening Chopin's Sonata in B-flat minor, Opus 35, will finish always the same way. Someone said that by playing with hypertexts, we escape two forms of oppression: having to follow sequences already decided upon by others and be condemned to the social division between those who write and those who read. This seems silly to me, but certainly playing creatively with hypertext, changing old story and helping create new story can be an enthralling activity, a fine exercise to be practiced at school, a new form of writing very much akin to the jam session. I believe it can be nice to modify stories that already exist, just as it would be interesting to transcribe Chopin for the mandolin. It would help to understand why the timbre of the piano was so much an integral element of the sonata in B-flat minor. But these games cannot replace the true educational function of fiction. Think of Victor Hugo's description of the Battle of Waterloo in Les Misérables. Unlike Stendhal, who describes the battle through Fabrizio del Dongo's eyes, who is in the midst of it and doesn't know what is going on, Hugo, that always believed to be God, describes it through the eyes of God, seeing it from above. He is aware that if Napoleon had known that there was a step descent beyond the crest of the Mont Saint-Jean plateau, but his guide had not told him so, General Millot Cuirassier would not have perished at the feet of the English army, and that if the little shepherd guide in Bülow had suggested a different route to him, the Prussian army would not have arrived in time to decide the outcome of the battle, and so on and so forth. With a role game, we could rewrite the Battle of Waterloo, making Grouchy French arrive instead of Blücher Germans, but the tragic grandeur of those pages by Hugo resides in the fact that instead, no matter what we want, things go the way they do. The beauty of War and Peace lies in the fact that Prince Andrei's agony ends with his death, however sorry it makes us. The painful wonder that every rereading of the great tragedies evoke in us comes from the fact that they heroes who could have escaped an atrocious fate through weakness of blindness still fail to realize where they are hidden and plunge into the abyss that they have dug with their own hands. In any case, Hugo tells us so after showing us what other opportunities Napoleon could have seized at Waterloo. Was it possible for Napoleon to win that battle? We reply, no. Why? Because of Wellington? Because of Blücher? No, because of God. This is what all the great narratives tell us. Maybe replacing God by fate, by the inexorable laws of life, by blind chance. The function of unchangeable story is precisely this. Against all our desires to change destiny, they make us feel physically the impossibility of changing it. And by doing so, no matter what story they are telling, they are also telling our own story, and that is why we read them and love them. We need their severe, repressive lesson. Rewriting stories can teach us about freedom and creativity. That is well and good, but is not everything. Stories that are already made also teach us how to die. I believe that educating us about fate and death is one of the principal functions of fiction. Thank you.